You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. Welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. It's been a very hectic last month for me personally and business-wise, but I've been working really hard to ensure that I keep pumping to bring you the very best information and guests that I can on Speaking Sidemount. Huge thanks to all of you who reach out to me each week and offer thanks, supportive comments and feedback. It's super gratifying to know that I'm able to have an impact, be it on your sidemount diving or just being able to bring you some of the coolest and best divers as guests to the show. Thanks again to XDeep for their support and sponsorship of this podcast. I'm deeply appreciative of both their personal support and also the support they are giving to help make Speaking Sidemount possible. Now, as many of you know, I'm a sidemount diver through and through. Many see sidemount as a tool to be used for specific dive plans or environments, but I prefer to see it as a platform. Now, by that I mean I can employ sidemount for a range of different dive plans and environments. Now, in some cases, this means changing my setup some, but in reality, it is the same argument a backmount open water diver would use if they chose to dive backmount in a wreck or cave. They are simply taking what they're well versed at using and applying it to a different environment. And there is nothing, and I mean nothing, special about diving a twin set that makes it more able to do this than sidemount. In fact, I would say the opposite case applies. Sidemount is way more flexible and more versatile, meaning it is better able to transition environments than a backmount twin set. So, when I saw that Yvonne Press, a sidemount and tech instructor based in Bali, was going to be speaking on open water sidemount diving at the Asia Dive Expo or ADEX, I had to find out more about her thoughts on this subject. In this episode, Yvonne shares her background in diving and sidemount diving. We talk about using sidemount in open water environments, about what it takes to be a good sidemount diver, and then we learn how she trains sidemount divers, and then we get into a really cool discussion on sidemount, closed-circuit rebreathers, and closed-circuit rebreathers in general. All of this and much, much more on this episode of Speaking Sidemount. Yvonne, welcome to Speaking Sidemount.
Thank you for having me, Steve. It's great to be here.
You're most welcome. Now, I saw of you recently. I was interviewing Darshana Jayawardena, or DJ from Sri Lanka, and I had a look at him presenting at ADEX in Singapore, and I saw you were as well. And then when I saw that you're also presenting on a subject very close to my heart, which is sidemount diving in open water, I thought we've got to talk. So I'm very pleased to have you here. I start almost all interviews, and I say this each week, with going through some background on my guests. So I'd love to learn more about you and also how you got started in diving.
Okay. I got started in diving about 16 years ago now by accident. A friend of mine was doing her advanced open water course, and I had a chance of either sit around or do my open water. So I did my open water. I then was a holiday diver for about 5 years, and then I sort of thought, you know what? I always spent the first 2 days of every holiday relearning how to dive. This has got to stop. I was living in Scotland at the time. I'm originally from Germany. The accent is all over the place. I'm in Bali now, as you know.
Yes.
But that's where the funny accent's from. So I took a dry suit course in Scotland. It wasn't as cold as I feared I would be. Signed up for my dive master course, and 6 months later quit my job and went full-time into diving. That's about 9 years ago now. Technical diving started around about the same year as my own diving on the side. So I was teaching recreational. That's what was putting food on the table. Technical was my own thing until I realized, wait a minute, I don't have time for my own thing. So I better get good enough at this so I can incorporate it into the teaching that I do. Mm-hmm. And eventually I came out to Bali to be in a location where diving happens 7 days out of 7. Therefore, easier to make a living, where you get in the water more. And I loved Scottish diving, don't get me wrong, but I needed to be somewhere where I could dive a bit more. Eventually became a technical instructor, discovered sidemount, and since then it's been pretty much, I reckon it's 50-50 between twin sets and sidemount, although at the moment I'm going through a 3-month stint of teaching nothing but sidemount. Right. So it depends a little bit on what's coming in, on what's happening, but it's something I love. And another thing that I discovered by accident.
Sure, sure. And so how did you get into Sidemount diving?
Because my instructor, who I was going through at the time, my Tech 50, he said, do you want to try Sidemount? Just in the pool, just this afternoon. And I was hesitant because I just worked out my buoyancy in a twin set, just got it to the happy place. I was like, oh, I'm going to try this thing. It's going to mess it all up again. And I got in that pool in a Hollis SMS 50 with a single tank initially. And I just felt so comfortable. Then tank number 2 came along and I was like, I'm still comfortable. And it's just so natural. So I signed up for my Sidemount course then and there. It was a TDI Sidemount course. It had to be technical because I was already qualified to 50 meters. So why not start full on? 4 tanks and everything. That was a learning curve, a very fast one. And since then, I've just continued playing and changing and trying things and working out how to be comfortable. And that's what I tell students. Keep playing, not so much working. Maybe it is work, but just look at things, look at other people. Don't take in everything you see, but have a go and make it work for your diving. So that was about 4 and a bit years ago now.
It's interesting with Sidemount because I think one of the fantastic things about Sidemount is its flexibility. And then with that flexibility comes this option to be able to, I talked to Andrew Goring, it's about tinkering with your gear and finding new ways and better ways and ways to optimize and perhaps new little pieces like some of the things he makes. And I find myself in my garage when I'm not diving, sitting down going, oh yes, now how can I make this a little bit better? How can I make this cylinder sit a little bit better? And you get yourself to this optimal point over a period of time. And I think it's one of the fun things about doing it.
If you like tinkering with gear, then this gives you endless opportunities to just kind of try something else. And I suppose Andrew Goring has taken that to the extreme, I guess, and made a business out of it. But I guess it started as a guy tinkering in his garage and going like, wait.
Oh, he still is. He reached out to me last week and he's got a new piece of equipment that he showed me and he was asking my opinion and I was trying to figure out where his mind was going and what he was trying to do. But I can imagine him sitting there with his arm reaching over, his shoulder around his back and trying to say, now, where's the best place for that to go? And so it is awesome. And of course, if you change things, like even if you go from wetsuit to dry suit or any of those sort of things, often it gives you an opportunity to look at adjusting your harness and adjusting the way your cylinders are mounted and so on. So agree with that. Well, look, one of the things that I talk about a lot is the benefits of Sidemount beyond just using it in caves to pass restrictions. And there's the school of thought out there that Sidemount is a tool and that it's really only fit for purpose. But I kind of look at it more as a platform rather than a tool. And by that, I mean, it's a platform upon which you can develop your gear to the point that you can dive it in any environment. Can you share a little bit about your thoughts on that?
I would agree with that in general. It's a tool is almost, it's looking at it in a limiting sense. One of the things that I believe is that, and that I've already said, it's that feeling of stability and just of comfort in the water that I suppose I now have in a twin set, but it took a lot longer to develop. So this natural buoyancy of having your tanks, having 2 tanks on your side, there's something to be said about that. So it encourages diving in trim, which is something that I think every instructor is encouraging in their students. And it's easier to achieve that with tanks on your side. It simply is. Yes, there is a bit of more complex gas management involved, but if you're set up correctly, that's not a hard thing. That's just I'm switching a regulator. That's easy. So there's the stability, there's the trim, there's buoyancy control, there is moving through the water so effortlessly because you are just a smaller entity, you're more hydrodynamic. I like that. Now, where I am in Bali, we dive quite often from the shore or from really small fishing boats. So you've got to imagine a wooden boat with a couple of outriggers. It's very stable, but it's got a narrow hull. Too narrow to sit on that with a twin set on. And really too narrow to put a twin set in and get kitted up and all of that. And Sidemount makes it possible to go and have that somewhat longer dive, to go and have that redundancy and simply get ready in the water. Jump in the water, captain hands you your tanks, very simple. There's so many things where it simply works so well. Another thing is just right outside the dive center where I'm based, we normally use a fiberglass fast boat. It doesn't take much of a swell to make it a little bit challenging to load that boat. Now, most of the diving that I do is technical diving now. Much, much easier to load 2 or 3 or 4 side mount tanks than it is to load a twin set, because I'm not particularly weak, but I can't lift a set of doubles over my head to hand to a crew member. Now I can just about do that with a single tank. So it is something that to me has so many benefits in the environment that I'm in. That's not saying that twin sets don't have benefits. It just means that it is a valid thing to do wherever you are.
I agree with that completely. And this episode hasn't come out yet, but I recorded an episode with one of my mentors and instructors, Tom Steiner. And Tom loves back mount diving. He's a fantastic back mount diver, but he's also a very, very good side mount diver. He is able to use both of them, not so much as tools, but as platforms again. And he's going to choose the right one for the right purpose. And I think he kind of, in his mind, he draws a line at advanced trimix. So up to 4 cylinders, no problem in side mount. But if it's going to be 5 or 6, then he's going to go back to back mount because there's real estate on his back. And managing that many cylinders, getting in and out of the water is a bit of a challenge. So I tend to agree with that. I think the other thing too is if, think of diving in Scotland for a moment or Scapa Flow or somewhere like that. If you've got ripping currents and big seas and you're trying to get in and out of the water and hand down cylinders and don them in the water with a current, that isn't going to work either. So I think we have to acknowledge there are limitations and times when it's not going to work. But on the balance of it, there's far, far more times when it's going to work well for you than not.
Yeah. Now, I would agree on the limit at 4 tanks. I have played with 6, but then it does feel like all this flexibility, all this movement that I gained by switching to side mount, I'm giving it back up because I've practically got a suit of armor around my front, which wouldn't feel quite so constrictive if I had a twin set on my back and I dealt with the stages in different locations. So, but then, how often do we really dive with 5 full-size tanks? But it goes back to choosing the right platform for the right job. So I would agree with what you're saying, what Tom's saying there. That makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, the boat issue, it's not an issue. It's a question of working out how you get on and off your boat. There's big boats, there's small boats. They have upsides and downsides. What I try and teach my students is to say, okay, when you're arriving at a dive center, have a look at what the ins and outs are. Generally, if you dive side mount, you've already let them know when you were booking that you're thinking about diving in side mount. Now have a look. What's the boat like? How are you going to get in and out of the water? What are the conditions like? Are we doing a negative entry? It's perfectly possible. But you need to think about what your process is. And that process can work in pretty much any situation.
Yes. No, I agree completely. And that's exactly the way that I look at it as well. And I do a lot of diving from ribs here, Richard Hull inflatables, which are fantastic platforms for side mount. Because what I find myself just messing around saying, well, today I'm actually going to don my cylinders on the boat. And I actually quite often do that because the rubber pontoons are fantastic for sitting your cylinder on each side, putting everything on. And admittedly, the entry is not particularly elegant because I don't like back rolling. Oh, excuse me, I knocked my mic. I don't like back rolling. So I tend to do a bit of a side roll in. But once I'm in, it's fantastic and it's very easy to don on a rib. Now, equally, it's pretty easy to have them handed over and don in the water. So you've got kind of 2 options on a rib. You don't have the option of walking around in any configuration on a rib. So where you're sitting is where you're going to do your entry and exit, and that's the way you've got to plan it. So, and then you contrast that with your little small outriggers where you don't really have the option in any configuration to don on the boat, so you're donning in the water. And so side mount is perfect for that. And then, like you, I've done some diving and ripping currents where negative entry is the only way to do it, and you've got to be able to don on the boat, and in some cases on a larger boat, be able to walk around with your cylinders on. So that's interesting too, isn't it?
Doable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing I noticed with that compared to back mount is that if you're using safety clips in particular, and when you're walking around with side mount cylinders, people don't think that's a good idea. I think it's absolutely fine. The cylinders actually sit down aligned with your spine, so you don't have this moment where you have to hunch forward to carry a heavy weight on your back. You are wide, so you have to maybe turn on your side every now and again, but I think that works perfectly fine on a larger boat.
And I think on a larger boat, again, I used to teach and dive in Thailand on an island that produces thousands of divers every year. The medium-sized boats fitted about 40-odd people.
Wow.
Now, I know. And on there, you now are actually talking about having some distance between where you might kit up and where you might get in the water. But again, you just have a look at it, you realize, okay, I'm going to be standing up with 4 full-size tanks. I want to minimize the amount of time or the amount of distance. So you try and pick a space near the exit, and you just talk to other divers, because most of the other divers will be single tank, and it matters not really if they walk another 5 steps. I agree it's hard and it feels heavy, especially when you're starting out. But you just explain to them, it's like, look, I'm going to be here with my 4 tanks, and there is a picture of me where you see 4 tanks around my front. You've got the stage tanks, which are inside, aligned right above my legs. My legs look like twigs, and that's what they felt like. And it was one of these things where I was like, guys, can we take this picture?
Yes.
Because my legs are going to shake and I need to get in the water. But it is about, I think, thinking it through and having a look at what you're working with. And you would do the same in a twin set. It's not a non-issue in a twin set. We are going through the same thought process. We're doing the same when we put on a rebreather. It's like, where do I want my bailout tanks? Where do I want this? What do I need help with? And what can I do myself?
Right.
It's the same idea.
Right, exactly.
We just do it for a different configuration.
Yeah, and just a bit of a shout out to my good friend Micha. He has done some really cool videos on different types of entry from boats. He takes it to the nth degree, which is what I love about that guy. You know, whatever he does to the fullest. And so there's about at least 5 different options he's showing for jumping in with 1 cylinder and having the other one passed down to you, jumping in with 2 cylinders, jumping in with no cylinders. And he's got some pretty good ways of managing that. They're not identical to the way I do it, but they're very close. And I think that's fine too. There's different ways to skin the cat. And so long as at the end of the day, you get in safely and efficiently, then fine.
Yep. And at the end of the day, you can do that from pretty much any boat. Is it particularly comfortable to sit on a boat waiting for a negative entry with 4 tanks on? No. But that's the same in a twin set.
Yes.
And it's the same in a rebreather with 2 stages. Can we please go now?
Yeah. But actually, I think back to my diving in truck last year, and I was diving with rebreather divers. We were doing up to 65, 70 meters here. It was always, well, the rebreather guys need all this space. You know, there's a lot of space for their units, a lot of space for their bailout. I'm carrying 4 cylinders. I needed less space because my deco cylinders were actually stowed, in a corner somewhere under the bow sort of thing, and they would be handed to me. So all I really needed, I was actually, just to make it faster for the boat guys, I was jumping in with my 2 primary side mount cylinders already donned, but for no other reason than the boat guys were so busy looking after the rebreather divers. And
handing stages off.
Exactly. So then I just had to wait my turn to get my 2 deco cylinders, don them, and away we went. And I made the point in the episode I did on truck that I really did not suffer alongside the rebreather divers, but with the one exception that I had just a little bit more deco to do, but not much. And then the other side of it was that my time at depth was a little bit more limited than theirs was. And a couple of them did some extraordinarily long dives. And I'm not really into hanging for 2 or 3 hours at, 12 to 6 meters anyhow. So it was, I was very happy with the dives that I did.
And somewhere like truck, I took a group there last November with Pete. It's flat calm.
Yes.
There's no currents to speak of. You have all the time in the world to get in the water. It doesn't really matter how quick you are at putting stuff on, at getting in the water, really. Although, as you go, I don't know how long you were there for. We were there for just under 2 weeks.
Same.
You get into a routine. You get an idea of what the distances are. And by the end of it, you're actually really slick. And so is everybody else. You're on the boat with the same people. So you've kind of got your process. You kind of found each other by then.
You just raised a point that is interesting to me, because one thing that from back to my Tom Steiner days as well, he is a man that is extremely chilled out in terms of when you're getting in the water. And I think this is a really good tip for technical diving, full stop, is for heaven's sake, take your time and don't rush things, and make sure that, yes, you have a process, but at the same time, nobody feels like they're being, waited on. I guess where I'm trying to get with that is, take your time, make sure you do everything properly, and be chilled out when you're getting in the water, because you need your head in the right space at the beginning of the dive.
Yeah. And, it goes back to more speed, less haste. I've just finished my Mod 3 user level course. We were going from the shore quite a few times, and you're kind of there, and I'm like, yeah, sorry, it's going to take me another minute to put that third tank on my left side because I'm running out of space. And it was just a question of, no, slow, smooth, and smooth ends up being fast. And that's, I think, even more true for Sidemount, even with 2 tanks. If you can work yourself out a process and just stick to it, or adjust it if it doesn't work, obviously. But have a holy order in which you do things, and that's the same every single time, you'll be fast.
In fact, one thing I do on my courses is I really say, hey, listen, I want you to watch me and watch what I do, and then follow and do it exactly the way I do it. Don't change anything. So from the point of view of, this is where you torque the cylinder, this is which hand you have doing what. Because I've worked this out over 5-6 years now, and I'm working with some very, very good instructors and divers, and it is the most efficient way that I'm aware of to do it. So if you follow this and then make that your process, and always do it the same way, you always don't. For me, I always don my left cylinder first, then goes my right cylinder. I always do it in a very specific way. In the water, I'm doing my descent in exactly the same way, my ascent in exactly the same way. So you try not to change things, because that's when you introduce a possible failure point, or you forget something.
And when you get interrupted, when you're sort of going through your little order and then something leaks, so you've got to get out again and fix something or change something, or a bungee goes and you're kind of like, okay, back to start. But if you can have that order, then at least you know what you're going back to, or you can actually look at it and go, okay, we're right here. So next comes this. I actually am lucky enough here where I am, we have a pool. Now, most of the courses I teach are TDI Sidemount courses. There's no requirement for a pool. I go in the pool because it gives me that luxury of doing everything at a depth where I can, if there's confusion, pop up to the surface, where I don't have waves to contend with when I'm going through things like, okay, donning and doffing, and again, and again, and again, so that it becomes a bit more natural before we head into the sea. That time that I spend on that first day of the course, you're going to get that back with every single entry that you do after that. Yeah. And the student ends up in a better place. Yeah.
I've got 2 kind of follow-up questions from the beginning, which is, firstly, what do you think it takes to be a really good Sidemount diver? What are some of the key principles that we should employ?
Bit of a love for equipment and tinkering with it, and a will to look at what you're doing and be open to improvement. I think in my own diving, I've made some of the biggest jumps when I've looked at pictures or videos that were taken unintentionally by people that happened to be on the dive. And I thought I was hot as anything, and I was awesome, and I looked at the pictures and I was like, whoa, tomorrow we're going to take a GoPro in the pool and we're going to change probably everything, but not at once. So I find this sort of willingness to continue to develop. And I do look at it in quite a playful way. It's sort of a question of, well, look at it. Is it working for you? First of all, it's not all about great Facebook pictures. If we get great pictures as a result, that's awesome, but really, at the end of the day, does it work? I dive aluminium tanks, they will rise up. There's nothing you can do about an aluminium tank at 70 bar. It will move up. You can have it clipped as close to your navel as possible. It'll have that tendency. But then have you set it up? So is it still in your slipstream? Is it actually starting to impair your swimming? Well, if it's not, then do we need to tinker with it? Can we tinker with it? Let's look at it. So,
And that's a really good point. I know a guy, I mentioned in one of the last episodes, a guy got ripped into doing a trimix course where their cylinders were aluminium and way out of trim. And fair enough. I mean, I felt for the guy, but certainly they weren't set up correctly. And you talk about sliding D-rings and bringing them all the way around to your navel, and that's absolutely what's required. And certainly for me, they go pretty much all the way around as well. And then the other thing that's really important is the position of your bolt snap at the bottom. And where do you place that? And then the other thing is, are you using, for me, I haven't found anything better than a loop bungee to torque the cylinder into your body as well. So by adjusting the position of that clip and also making sure you've got the right torque on your loop bungee, even though the cylinder has become very buoyant, you can make sure that it's close to your body. And what happens with me, certainly down to about 50 bar in aluminium, is that they are still aligned with my body, but you can feel it. Actually, I quite like the feeling, because what tends to happen is they actually start to crush me a little bit. It's quite interesting because they torque in so tight. When I say crush, it's not a bad feeling. I noticed this in Niue, which was my last aluminium experience, was the later on the dive it got, the tighter they came into my body. They were pulling up, and as they pulled up, they pulled inwards. And that's the feeling that you really want. So just some tips for anyone out there listening who's struggling with aluminium cylinders is just make sure that you focus on getting all of those aspects correct.
And try and get somebody to get you some video. Pictures lie, video doesn't lie. Video is actually quite cruel in that sense. If you can even just go have a little clip, move your tanks from, let's say you have a hip D-ring and one closer to your navel, see what the distance is. Get that GoPro in and see what the distance is between, especially if you're small, between the end of the bolt snap that clips into your harness and the tank. Can that distance be made shorter? I have quite a few Asian students that are generally, if I say short and skinny, I don't mean it in a bad way.
Petite would be the word, right?
Petite, that are petite. So you have to think a bit harder and really look at each piece of your rigging, which I think brings me to the point that, going back to your question of what it takes to be a really good Sidemount diver, get your own equipment.
Oh, yes.
Stop renting. You'll never be happy. It'll never be perfect. You can spend 2 hours setting up that rental harness. It's never yours. It'll never be right there.
No, agreed. And back to the petite diver side, I don't know if you've ever met Audrey Cadell, but Audrey is a very petite woman and without question, one of the best Sidemount divers I've ever seen. And so she has absolutely no issues diving Sidemount. And so size is not an excuse. I've found with my students, it's easier to set up big men. When I say big men, especially tall men, because the cylinders, they've got the length of torso and leg, that their cylinders aren't down around their knees, which is where they are on me just quietly. But that's fine. They're a little bit easier, but so what? There is no reason why a small person, a male, female, whatever, can't be set up perfectly in Sidemount. And so it's just a matter of making the adjustments you need to make for your body type.
And it is a matter of picking a harness that works for you, but that's potentially also made for the type of cylinders you're diving. There's a lot of harnesses that work a lot better with steel cylinders, and there's others that will work better with aluminium, and there's a few that'll work with either. If you can find that out before you buy, you'll be happier and you'll not end up selling the first one.
And look, it's no secret X-Deep sponsor my podcast, and I've dived X-Deep for 6 years. I love them. I don't know what you dive.
X-Deep.
Okay, all right. We can be X-Deep fanboys and girls for a little while, because there's others around that I really like. I super respect Razor and Steve Bogarts and HP Uto and those guys. I think they do a great job, and it's a great harness. I just don't happen to use it. Having said that, I've dived X-Deep for 6 years, right from the classic. I have a tech harness, I have a recreational harness, and I don't use the classic anymore. I kind of think it's been overrun by the recreational and tech harnesses. And I just find, for me, the tech harness fits really, really well. It's, to be honest, the wing is probably slightly too big for me, and I've tried using the recreational one a little bit, and it works great for me too. So I think if you are a petite person, there is an opportunity to look at that recreational BCD, because it's a little smaller. And then you just have to make the decision, is there enough lift in there for you if you're going to be diving trimix with 4 cylinders? But I certainly, in truck, I did use the recreational one, and that was where I was using Miher's classic BCD across my shoulders as well, which I loved doing. So the other thing with the XD, especially the tech, is that I can dive 2 steel cylinders, 2 aluminium deco or stage cylinders, no problem. I can equally dive 2 aluminium cylinders, no problem. And it's a very minor adjustment between the two for me fact, there's next to no adjustment, to be brutally honest. I make the adjustments on the cylinders. So,
well, when I bought the X-Deep, I had done all my initial training on an SMS 50, which I think is a nice harness if you're diving 2 tanks. If you have 4 S80s on it, air 50% and oxygen, all of them are heavy, and you just are not comfortable on the surface. It's also not what it's made for. So it's beyond the capacity of that harness, which I didn't know when I was learning. But I just realized that the harness was fully inflated. I was making dolphin noises on the surface, but I still kind of wanted my regulator right by my mouth. So when I bought my X-Deep, which is the Stealth Tech, it was largely about lift, lots and lots of lift. And I had tried it before and I knew it was comfortable. I knew it would take me a little bit to set it up perfectly for me, but even the one that I had just borrowed off a friend worked. Nothing was quite in the right place just yet, but it was perfectly safe. I could dive. I've had that harness now pretty much for, we're going on 3.5, 4 years, and it dives. I've had to change the bungees. Well, that's no surprise. But and what I do love about that harness is the weight pocket. I call it a spine of weights, really.
Yes, spine pocket.
That just allows you to put, I don't really need weight, even on 2 tanks, but I like having 1 trim weight just right under the bladder, because all that buoyancy stretches right around your kidneys, and having just that kilo, not because you need the weight, but because you want to trim out and just counteract that buoyancy a little bit. It's just such an easy way. And I found with students, I can actually get to it underwater if I really need to give it away because somebody is starting to get buoyant at the end of the dive. I can. It's almost a quick release.
Yeah.
Not that we really want that, because we do want, or I want, a balance rig when I dive with students. The idea being, why do you need to be overweighted? You can control where you are, or you should be. And if you can't yet, then that's what we need to work on, as opposed to just throwing another weight on, which is just a placebo. Now, I'm a big fan. Again, as you're saying, that doesn't mean that there aren't really good other harnesses out there, but it's a bit like, I love this one. I look at others and I kind of go, yeah, okay, there's a lot of copies. There's a lot of manufacturers who looked at it and went like, yeah, that works. Yeah. And that's fair enough. That'll, it's the highest form of flattery, isn't it? Somebody copying what you're doing.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And no, I agree completely. And you mentioned sort of setting them up for students. And that's the other thing I appreciate is being able to very quickly, within 15, 20 minutes, you can get an initial fit done for a new student. And yes, you'll probably adjust that after the first dive and maybe a couple more times during the course, but certainly you can get there very quickly because of the multiple different straps that it has rather than just one piece of webbing. So we talked a little bit about your training, and we started to sort of allude a bit around the way your attitude to that and your focus on training. I'm interested in how you train side-mount divers.
Many people, especially if they come to Bali, come for a weekend or a long weekend. And it's this idea of getting to being a perfect side-mount diver in 2 days. Now, we can lay foundations. We can lay half-decent foundations in 2 days. They're going to be busy days, but it's going to be foundations. And what I try and achieve in those 2 days is pretty much get the student to a point where they understand all the different elements that can make a difference, and everything will make a difference. Your rigging on the tank will make a difference. Your harness will make a difference. Every little detail. Now, will you have that perfect by the end of 2 days? I wish, but it doesn't happen. Didn't happen to me. I tinkered for a while. What I'm actually enjoying doing and starting to do more of is people that come and say, you know what, I did a side-mount course about a year ago, a year and a half ago, and it's okay, but it's not great yet. I can kind of understand that I can do things better, but I can't really get there.
Yes.
Not without somebody looking at me, not without somebody giving me some feedback. What would you do? And actually doing these workshops where all we do is tinker and look at videos and then tinker again, and probably for the first couple of days don't really get away much from the site that I use for training here that is 10, 15 meters. If you're into photography, it's a muck dive. If we're training, it's an insensitive bottom. So it works for both things. and actually not really going off performance requirements, but going, okay, so where do we want to get to? What do you actually want to do? What do you want to do with your side mount diving? One of the best things I've done last year that sort of worked in so many different ways is we had a guest here who's a photographer. She's not a professional photographer, but she turns out professional quality pictures. I saw her underwater. I was just fun diving. She was following one of our dive guides with aluminium tanks, and she won't mind me saying that, flying behind her. Mm-hmm. And I was like, you trained in steel, didn't you? I couldn't really stop myself from asking. And she sort of said, yes, I did train in steel. And I was like, you do realize your tanks were pretty much near enough your ankles? She's like, yeah, I realized I was hitting them. I was like, yeah, well, if you've got some time, we can look at this. So we ended up doing a deal. She came for a side mount workshop, and we then arranged to have some pictures taken. But that workshop was really nice because we have somebody here that understands side mount, understands the configuration to a degree, but hasn't quite thought about how can we make it a lot more comfortable. And if you're starting to carry that big camera, 2 big strobes, you're a huge entity. The last thing you need is your tanks flying behind you as opposed to actually helping your propulsion, helping all of that. Stuff like that. It's nice to train divers, it's nice to certify people, but actually just going back to working on getting things just that little bit better, more comfortable, more suitable to what you want to do, that's quite a lot of fun. You don't have time for that on a foundational course unless people have time to stay a week. That is awesome, but not many people do, especially when they are initially.
It's an interesting thing. I spoke to Matteo a little bit about this as well, as about generating new students and the price of courses and all that sort of thing. And I've seen exactly the same thing. And my opinion is you certainly cannot produce a competent side mount diver in 2 days. And as you said, you can give them a start, you can get their equipment set up, and you can get them in the water and run through the initial basic side mount skills, but then going on and bedding them in and then getting the emergency skills spot on, or at least to a level that is suitable, in my opinion, takes a minimum of 4 days and at least 3.5 days of that in the water and doing video analysis and so on. So it is difficult. And I do get quite a few students myself who've been on other courses, haven't quite got what they wanted, or have changed harness, which is the other thing. They've started on one and now they've moved to X-Deep or a Razor or something that's more suited to what they're doing, and they need help with that. And so, yes, I think that's a great thing to do, is to run those workshops. And it also points to the fact that certification is one thing, and becoming competent and good at something is a completely different thing. And so, yes, you want a certification standard, but you also want to, if you're a student, I say this, you always want to be a student of diving. So I'm more than happy to sort of go in the water with somebody and say, hey, can you have a look at me doing this, and let's see if I can improve it. I've dived for quite a few GUE divers, and while their rigidity is a little annoying to me, I'll put it that way, I love the standard that those guys dive at in most respects, and I respect their process. I think that's where they're really, really strong, is around process and equipment discipline and team discipline. So those sort of things. And I treat the world like a smorgasbord. I'll steal the bits I want and I'll leave behind the bits I don't want, and side mount is suited to that, isn't it?
It totally is. And it'll never be, and I think maybe that is where GUE's hesitation comes from. You can't standardize it as much as you can standardize twin set setups. At least I don't think you can, because it comes from a completely different mindset. It comes from making something work for really individual circumstances, as opposed to standardizing it so that we don't have to worry about everybody having something slightly different. Now, I happen to have a side mount setup that, at least where regulators are concerned, largely mirrors my back mount setup, short hose on the left, long hose on the right, because that way I don't need to think too much when I switch back. It also means if I dive in mixed teams, it's easy. They know gas will be donated from this side. There's a long hose on this side. It makes sense. And for me personally, I can't see the benefit of having one regulator coming from the left, one from the right. I'm sure there'd be plenty of divers that could explain to me why they love it.
The IC 1 meter hose guys do that, and I think it makes sense for what they're doing, and it does create some constraints for them They're very much about the DIR, donate what you breathe, right? And that's such an interesting discussion. And I've spoken to Toddy directly about that and talked to a lot of ISC guys in Europe about it. And then equally, my interview with Steve Bogart's way back, he kind of mirrored the thoughts that you just put across, which is, let's develop something that is easy to configure, that's very similar to the way that we dive back mount doubles, that when we get in the water, your long hose is on the right. The divers who you're diving with in a mixed team know that you're going to donate a long hose in exactly the same way as they would do it. The only difference is it in your mouth or is it clipped off? And I think the benefit to that is, at least with Sidemount, you should have breathed that cylinder within 2 to 5 minutes ago. And so we've been testing it right the way through our dive, as opposed to a back mount double setup where you test breathed it before you got in the water, but you might have been in the water for half an hour, dragging it through God knows what until at the point of donation. So I think that's a benefit myself. So
Sidemount gives you all the options, but that does come potentially with a bit of confusion, with a bit of extra briefing time needed when you are diving in mixed teams, when you have different setups. I've actually just been asked last night whether I could bring these things, adapters, and I was sort of like, no, we're going to find DIN tanks. No, we will. So there's things where it's like, I know we can make Sidemount work pretty much everywhere, but please, can we find DIN tanks? These things are huge, and the entanglement hazard on them is just...
I know. I've dived them way back. I wrote a blog article on diving in Hawaii, and I had exactly that experience. I asked for DIN valves. They said, yeah, no problem. I turn up, no DIN valves. And then on the boat, there happened to only be one adapter, so I dived single cylinder Sidemount. So I was determined, to do it. They weren't going to make me go back mount. And then the next day they got me 2 converters. So, but I'm a big fan of pro valves for that reason. You can just take an insert out, put the insert back in, go from one to another. And so if you're listening out there and you're a dive operator, please fit pro valves so that you're with inserts, so you can deal with all of your customers, including tech divers. So
it's one of these things where it's like, yes, we can adjust to the nth degree, but that's really not the point. The point was streamlining. The point was to reduce entanglement hazards. So let's not throw them all back in if we can at all avoid it. But it's getting easier.
Yeah, it is. And look, I'm seeing more and more. Mind you, I'm kind of living in my own bubble sometimes, and where I go now, if I'm educating someone, I'm finding people much more amenable. I went to Niue, and the operator there was just fantastic. Sometimes you can meet this little bit of resistance. It was more from a point of view of he wanted to learn, okay, well, here's a Sidemount diver. How do I work with this particular individual, and how do I make it easy for him, because I'm his customer, but behest on me to make it easy for him as well. And we met in the middle, and it was fantastic. I find now more and more that operators are easier to work with than they used to be. Certainly different to 5 years ago, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I found it even sort of within the company that I work for at the moment, it's just saying to people, look, at the end of the day, a recreational Sidemount diver on a 2-tank boat is a person that needs 2 tanks on a 2-tank boat.
Yes.
Only they want them to be DIN tanks. That's it. Oh, really? Yes, really. We'll check with them if they think they're going to run 3 tanks across 2 dives, and then you bring an extra tank. But that's it for recreational Sidemount diving. It's not that hard.
Yeah. And I find recreational, one thing that it sort of bothered me for a while, because I came out of Gozo and we'd love to do long dives there. So we'd do our 2-cylinder, hour and a half, 2-hour dives, and we'd spend some time at depth and then a lot of time in the shallows, practicing drills. And I became very accustomed to that. So when I came back to New Zealand, I was often on a boat where we couldn't get a fill between dives, and I didn't have extra cylinders. But what I came to realize was that, yes, I'd set myself aside a contingency from the first dive. I'd set myself a limit and say, okay, I'm going to be surfacing at this gas pressure. I want to be out of the water at this gas pressure. Usually I'd be out with 130 bar. And then on the next dive, I've got that entire 130 bar and 2 cylinders to dive with. Yeah. And so I've actually got my contingency from the first dive plus my contingency from the second dive. So I was in a better position than people who were swapping cylinders out, diving single cylinder. And so it's always good to have more gas. I'm loving that every time.
Yeah, and you generally are. You have more gas. You have access to your regulators if something goes wrong.
Yes.
You can have a pretty much full-on free flow, and you're feathering your way out of it. I've never had to do that for free flow. I've had to do that for leaking first stages. It doesn't really matter what you're doing it for, but you're not really losing gas. And it's in front of you. It's so much more controllable.
Yes.
than it would be on a twin set where you're working your way through what's actually just happened.
Or a single cylinder, right, where you have no redundancy.
You just,
you're reliant on a buddy and getting out of the water, right?
Yeah, which I don't really do much single cylinder anymore, and it's a bit like, where's everyone else?
To put a term on it, I feel naked. I feel kind of exposed.
Yeah, pretty much.
I never used to be nervous diving single cylinder, and now I am. And it's more about just the comfort of having 2 cylinders, 2 regulators, 2 first stage, 2 second stages.
It goes back to what we said about a process. If you have that process of getting ready, getting ready to get in the water, but also getting ready to get back on the boat, I'm just as fast. And that came with time and with repetition and with doing it again and again and again. And I think that's something that new Sidemount divers need to realize. It took you a few dives to get comfortable in a single tank back mount. It's going to take you a few dives to get everything to that stage where it's second nature in Sidemount. It would be the same on a twin set. So if you're wanting that redundancy, this is potentially a way that is easier. And that's even before we talk about opening up technical exploration in areas where we don't have twin sets and all of these things, where it's just such an awesome facilitator.
Agreed. So I mentioned in the beginning that you're speaking at AGEX on Sidemount diving in open water, and you and I spoke off mic a little bit about whether that might be potentially controversial. I hope not. But I'm really interested in your perspective on Sidemount diving open water. We've touched on some of it, but share a little insight into what your presentation is going to be.
So the presentation is going to pretty much start out with some of the things we've touched on: flexibility, configurability. You can make it what you need it to be. Comfort, headspace for photographers, times where it actually makes sense. Small boats. I'm in an area where there's a lot of small boats, but I've dived side mounts from big boats. It's doable. And one of the other things that I just touched on, it's technical exploration. About 2 years ago, together with a couple of colleagues, we started exploring Southwest Lombok. Even by Indonesian standards, Southwest Lombok is a little bit like the end of the world. We're talking somewhere where there's normally no gas other than air. They weren't in tanks, but that's because I asked for them early enough. No gas analyzer, no nothing, most definitely no twin sets, and also a limited window of opportunity when the conditions were suitable. It didn't make sense to bring twin sets in, not with the boats, not with the waves, not with what we were expecting from conditions. And that's one of, I think, sort of one of these huge benefits where you bring in Sidemount, you have redundancy, you have a way to start opening up an area, to start exploring safely. You're not going in a single tank with a couple of extra tanks strapped to your side, which would give you the same amount of gas, but it's not streamlined, it's not comfortable. If you're in those currents, you're pretty much a garage door that flies with them, as opposed to being a compact unit. So what I'm hoping is to maybe just plant a little seed in people's minds that open ocean diving, technical diving, is also about choice. So some of us prefer twin sets, some of us prefer Sidemount. Sidemount has its place. Yes, it comes from cave diving. Yes, caves and wrecks are potentially the place to dive Sidemount, but open ocean's not a bad place if you are coming from a small boat. If you are looking at doing a longer dive in an area where there aren't twins around, there's so many opportunities. And that, to me, I think is probably the main thing about Sidemount. It just opens up your world of diving if you can have a bit of an open mind about it. Now, I'm really hoping that it's not going to end up being a big discussion. As in, discussion's fine, but I understand that a lot of people might disagree or might just not have thought about it. Is it a fad? I don't know. It's grown in popularity. Technical diving has grown in popularity. So do we call it a fad? I don't know. To me, it's just a bit negative looking at it that way. I think it has its place, and I think it's here to stay.
Yeah, agreed. You've listed off a lot of the benefits of Sidemount diving, and if we say the benefits of streamlining, the benefits of assisting trim, I think we both agree it's easier in Sidemount than back mount. Certainly, I watch some of the best technical divers in the world in back mount. Their trim is not as good as the best Sidemount divers. Certainly, their cylinders are not aligned as well. So all of these things, when we look at that, the inflexibility, ease in and out of the water, access to valves. Some people aren't particularly flexible in the shoulders, especially men, and especially when you're wearing thick undergarments and dry suits. So trying to reach valves is a problem. Trying to carry cylinders is a problem. So if we say all of those things are real benefits, then it shouldn't matter, because we haven't talked about passing restrictions with any of those, have we?
No, and that's where really, there comes another thing. You can see, well, you went to truck. I went to truck and took my rebreather, and it came back with a few new scratches. So be it. But by having your cylinders where you can see them, not just imagine where they are, because if you're diving twin sets, you have an idea of how tall you are, how high up these valves are.
Yes.
But you can't see it. You can't confirm it until you've nudged something.
Yeah.
Whereas by looking in front of you, looking underneath you in Sidemount, you can. You'll know. And we're not even talking yet about taking tanks off and pushing them forward. Granted, you can do that in a twin set, but the effort and the potential for something to go wrong. And I'm not against twin sets. I just think that, especially when we're coming to smaller areas, looking into restrictions, and it doesn't even have to be a full-on cave or a full-on wreck, but even a smaller overhang, something that is not even a cavern yet, you can squeeze in and have a look. And you can get back out again without too much effort. You have a lot less potential for a catastrophic failure because there's two single tanks. Really, really, really small chance that you're smashing both of those first stages at the same time, or that both of those bursters go at the same time. That doesn't make a twin set unsafe. That just delivers a few more arguments for Sidemount. Yeah.
Interesting. So you mentioned that you dive CCR. What model of CCR or what unit do you dive?
I'm on an AP. So there's a yellow box on my back. You can always see me, even in dark environments.
Yes.
That choice was made sort of from a bit of an economic point of view. I'm a diving instructor. I live in Indonesia, which means I am a millionaire, but in Indonesian rupiah. And that is not the same thing. So what I was looking at was getting into a unit where I would have reasonably easy access to a used unit that I could buy for myself, because it was the only way to get practice in to dive regularly. I'm starting to look at Sidemount rebreathers, but I haven't quite made up my mind yet whether it's something that I want to cross over into. I'm not sure yet, but having just gone through a Mod 3 100-meter rebreather course, pretty much having got to the end of individual bailout, because there's a limited amount to how many stages you can carry. Yes, there's safety divers and other options. There's team bailout and lots of other ways. But you're hitting a point where a bailout rebreather suddenly becomes the thing. Now, I haven't won the lottery, so...
This is an issue, isn't it? Yeah.
Look, you choose to work as a diving instructor, yes, it will be an issue. On the other hand, I can get in the water pretty much every day, so I'm not complaining. Where if I had stayed working a corporate job, which I did before, I would potentially now have the money in the bank for that bailout rebreather. I wouldn't have managed to get the hours up on the initial rebreather yet. So it's a trade-off. And I think most of us make this choice if we're full-time in this industry.
I agree with you. I've made this statement many times when I was working in Gozo, and I don't mind sharing. I went from being an executive in a software company to a diving instructor, and was earning 18 euros a day and smiling, believable. I've never been so happy. But obviously that wasn't sustainable for me. But the bottom line was, you're not in it for money necessarily. You can make money in this industry, but you've really got to hunt around for ways to do it. And equipment is a bit of an issue. Just on the AP side, a lot of my friends here, as you know, pygmies and a lot of the guys in New Zealand here dive APs and love them. And there's a big AP community. And so that's a big driver, I think, around a lot of the guys here. There's very good instructors, number one. It's a good unit. And number two, if you ever need to swap something out, it's easy to find someone who's got a part. So that's a pretty cool thing. And certainly if you're going on Pete's trips, there'll be a lot of APs there. He dives the JJ as well, which by all intents and from what I know is a very good unit. For those listeners out there looking at CCR and considering Sidemount, if you go back through some of the back episodes, I've been through pretty much the entire gambit now. And it's been quite selfish on my part because this is my research. And so I'm sort of now zeroing in. I'm zeroing in now, and I'm able to do it remotely. I don't even have to really get in the water, although you actually should really do that. You should go and try units out. But I've spoken way back to Gary Dallas about the SF2, and I've spoken actually off mic to Richard Harry Harris about the SF2 as well. So I've got some good background on that unit. I've spoken to both Jill Heineth and Steve Bogarts on the Liberty, Divesoft Liberty a little bit. This one hasn't come out yet, but I spoke to Ed Sorensen briefly on the Liberty as well. Toddy gave me a fantastic run into the T-Reb, and that side mount rebreather is pretty exciting. It should be coming to market in the European summer, so that's an exciting one to look out for. And by the time this episode comes out, Yvonne, next week's episode's with Ed Sorensen, and we go into the Sidewinder, because Sidewinder really, really deep. So I'm super excited about that unit. It's very different, very hybrid between back and side, but enables us as side mount divers to stay in the configuration we're in and add a rebreather on top of it pretty much. And I missed the sidekick, which I covered with Brian Kaycock, who loves that unit. So I've been through the whole market almost. There's a Revo and a few others that I haven't looked at, but for the listeners who are looking at side mount CCR, as I am personally, just look back through those episodes and you'll get some good info. And then I think you just have to come in the water and try them, see what works for you. And as you said, you've got to save the pennies. Money, not just for the unit, but also for the training and what goes with that.
It's one of those things. If you look at, I mentioned TDI a couple of times, but if you look at some of the online learning, it pretty much says a rebreather is unlikely to pay back what you paid for it in the gas savings. I disagree. It depends on your diving, obviously,
Yes.
but if your diving is sub 45 meters and therefore starting to involve more and more helium, it will pay back. You're looking at paying really rather small amounts of money for really rather deep dives and exciting dives. Truck was an example. We did a lot of dives that were at trimix depths. I was actually rather surprised by how small my gas bill was, but it was just the gas that I had used on the rebreather. And obviously, if you're using the bailouts, then you'd be really happy to pay for them because you're still able to pay for them. So so does it pay back for it? It's just a different way of diving. I can also understand people saying, I don't want to get into this complexity, but I liked having the time. I like having the silence, the lack of bubbles. Where I am in Bali, we have some really interesting deep reefs. One of the benefits of being here is that I have easy access to shallow training sites that are calm and sheltered and good for learning, but I've got access to depth. A lot of these reefs go to below 100 meters, and I don't need to travel for hours and hours and hours. Now, that still means I need a safety diver, et cetera, and buddies and all that. But there's a really good argument for it. So the AP was a choice of something that I thought, it's been around for a while. It's proven. I kind of wanted something that wasn't a complete unknown. On your side mount rebreathers, have you got a favorite that you're admitting to? Or?
I have, but I'm going to keep it to myself for now. But I'll give you some clues. If you listen to next week's episode, you're going to start to see. So I've narrowed it in my mind down to two. I spoke to Audrey Cadell about this too, because she's doing exactly the same thing as me. And again, I'm not a big guy, so for me, the size of the unit is a big deal. So the things that I'm looking at, and all side mount divers, I think, need to consider these things. Number one, the size of the unit relative to your body is important. Worker breathing is a big deal. And Jill Heineth just last week put out a video on the Liberty where she talked about worker breathing and the challenges that side mount rebreathers bring with that versus back mount. And when I interviewed her on this, she was a big fan of people trying back mount rebreathers first to understand what worker rebreathing should be like. Then you get into the side mount rebreather and you feel the differences and you appreciate what they are. When I spoke to, again, it's interesting how I can refer back to this, but I spoke to Gary Dallas, and his opinion was, well, yes, it's going to be different, but it's going to be different. So during your diving, you can, in fact, manage that. But having said that, again, a friend of mine reached out to me the other week about a near miss that a friend of his had with a rebreather where they had a collapsed trachea due to worker breathing at depth, and that is terrible, So having something that affects you physiologically when you head down at depth, that could be a big problem in certain environments. So I think all of these things go together to say, when I'm personally looking at a side mount rebreather, I'm looking at the size of the unit, and I'm definitely looking at worker breathing, and they're going to be two of the big factors. The other thing I'm looking at is I'm a side mount diver through and through. The things I love the most about it is the balance, the trim, the stability. I don't want to be giving that away. So whatever unit I'm looking at has got to be able to be completely stable alongside what I'm already diving, and the least amount of change from my existing diving. So listen to next week's episode. By the time this one comes out of Yvonne, it'll already be in the history books, but I'm really excited about that. And I think over the balance of this year, I'm actually going to go and start and do some training and start exploring it. And we'll cover that training and speaking side mount as well, so we can share experience and see whether what I'm doing helps some other people out there with their journey into looking at CCR if they wish to do it. Just before we finish that, you raised one other point, which is about complexity. And I think people need to realize that open circuit diving, even at a technical level, is relatively simple in comparison to CCR diving. And so if you are a person who likes to get in the water quickly and likes to run through a process, but not to the degree of CCR. So if you were concerned that you would gloss over things, you shouldn't go to CCR. I think you have to be meticulous. You have to be a checklist person. And if you're not that way inclined, then perhaps open circuit diving is better for you than CCR diving.
One thing I would say, just to go along with that, is I believe that you can't treat CCR diving like many people treat skiing holidays in Europe. It's something they do for 1 week a year and then not for 51. CCRs are complex, or what I tend to say to students that ask me about it is CCRs are clever. So if you do not keep up with them, they will out-clever you, and that is when problems start happening, because you won't realize what is maybe not going wrong, not going right. You just cannot possibly remember what you're looking out for. So go do a CCR trial. Go do a 1 day here, 1 day there, try different units and work out whether you really want to get into this. You don't have to buy a unit to become qualified on one, but if you're going to stick with it, even more so than side mount, you need your own unit.
Totally.
It has to become a major part of your diving. If you think that you're not prepared for that, then open circuit's just fine. There's nothing wrong with it.
There's many divers, 45 meters and less, that you can do, even a truck, right? I mean, trucks wrecks at 45 meters that you can dive as a Tech 45 caddy diver or an advanced trimix and deco procedures diver at TDI or the equivalent. So it's full of dives you can do.
Yeah, there's so much to see at 45 meters and shallower. And if you want to do the odd deeper one, how often do you go to truck? Pete would say it's not a once in a lifetime. I agree with that. It's got to be a few more times. There's too much to see. But you'll do that. You'll do a big trip like that once every couple of years, 3 years, or something like that. So,
I'm back next year, so next June.
So am I, next November.
Oh, you're on the November. Tom Steiner's actually doing the November one as well, so maybe I should swap.
For those highlight trips, you can save up, or you can find a way to pay for the helium.
Oh, sure.
It's worth it. Technical diving costs money. Skydiving costs money. Golfing costs money. It's a big hobby.
Yeah.
So,
just learn to live with it.
Or for some of us, it's our life.
Agreed. Well, Yvonne, thank you very much. I've enjoyed talking to you. I wish you all the best for your presentation. Is it next week at 8X?
It's this week. We're on now Tuesday. Don't quote me, it's either Friday or Saturday. I should know that, but I'm doing 2 on different subjects. So It's either Friday or Saturday. Yeah.
Well, by the time this episode comes out, it'll be done and dusted. So I wish you all the best.
So I can let you know how it went.
You can. But I hope it goes very well for you and you enjoy the run to Singapore. And I've enjoyed learning more about your diving, and I'm glad that we share some perspectives there. And in the main agree, it's a sign of your intelligence that you agree with me. So...
I say that to people. It's like, look, life would be so much easier. Just do what I asked you to do first, and we'll all be happy.
Awesome. And I hope we can catch up sometime. It's a shame that we're in truck at different times.
Yeah, you should come to 8X.
I should. Look, I can't.
There, all the best people are there.
I know. I can't get away from New Zealand at the moment. I'm tied to this place. But later this year, I'll certainly be back into traveling. And if I can't make it this year, I'll try and make it another year.
Yeah, come to Bali. It's easy. Yes. I'm not sure how difficult it is from New Zealand, but it's certainly easy enough from Australia. Yeah,
we fly to Australia, and then there may be direct flights. Yeah, I'll add it to the list. Thank you very much.
Do some sidemount diving. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.